November 14th, 1944. A signals intelligence tent in the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Sergeant Leonard Hayes sat hunched over his radio set at 3 in the morning, his headphones pressed so tightly against his ears that they left red marks on his skin, and he listened to the voice of a German officer ordering the deaths of 200 American soldiers. The transmission was crystal clear. Every word, every coordinate, every detail of the ambush that would be sprung at dawn on a convoy of American trucks carrying wounded men to a field hospital behind the lines. Leonard's hand trembled as he wrote down the information. Behind him, the other radio operators were asleep in their cots, exhausted from another day of mocking his homemade antenna, the contraption of rusty wire and salvaged metal that hung from a dead tree outside the tent, like the skeleton of some strange bird. They had laughed at him for weeks. They had called him the junk collector, the wire wizard, the fool who thought he could outperform the Army's standard-issue equipment with garbage he found in bombed-out buildings. But now Leonard was listening to transmissions that the standard equipment could not pick up. Transmissions on frequencies that the Germans thought were secure. Transmissions that, in the next 8 hours, would save the lives of men who would never know his name. He reached for the field telephone to call his commanding officer, and as he did, another German voice crackled through his headphones, and then another and then another. By the time the sun rose over the Hürtgen Forest, Leonard Hayes had intercepted 47 separate German transmissions, and no one was laughing anymore. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal the unsung heroes, the forgotten moments, and the quiet acts of brilliance that changed the course of history. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and help us remember these stories together. Now let us go back to the beginning, to understand how a farm boy from Nebraska became the most valuable radio operator in the European theater. Leonard Hayes was born in the spring of 1921 on a wheat farm outside a town called Broken Bow in the sandhills of central Nebraska. His father, Walter, was a third-generation farmer who measured his life by the rhythm of planting and harvest. His mother, Martha, was a schoolteacher who had given up her classroom to raise 4 children in a house with no electricity and no running water. Leonard was the youngest, and from his earliest years, he was different from his siblings. While his brothers worked the fields and his sister learned to cook and sew, Leonard spent his time tinkering with machines. He took apart the family's wind-up clock when he was 6 years old, spreading its gears and springs across the kitchen table like the organs of some mechanical creature. His mother had been furious until he put it back together, and the clock ran better than it had in years. By the time Leonard was 10, he had discovered radio. A traveling salesman had stopped at the farm one autumn afternoon, selling everything from patent medicine to kitchen gadgets. Among his wares was a crystal radio kit, a simple device that could pick up AM broadcasts using nothing but a coil of wire, a crystal detector, and a pair of headphones. Leonard's father had no money to spare for toys, but Martha saw something in her youngest son's eyes that made her reach into the cookie jar where she kept her emergency savings. She bought the kit for 35 cents, and she handed it to Leonard without a word. That night, Leonard stayed up until dawn, following the instructions by candlelight, winding copper wire around an oatmeal container, adjusting the cat's whisker detector, until suddenly, miraculously, he heard a voice in his headphones. It was a radio station from Omaha, 200 miles away, and the voice was reading livestock prices. Leonard did not care what the voice was saying. He cared that he had reached out into the invisible world of radio waves and pulled something back. He had touched the ether, connected with something beyond the horizon, and he knew in that moment that his life would never be the same. The years that followed were defined by Leonard's obsession. He built bigger and better radios, scavenging parts from junkyards and broken appliances, teaching himself electronics from library books and mail-order courses. By the time he was 15, he had constructed a transmitter powerful enough to reach amateur radio operators across the country, and he had earned his ham radio license, call sign W9LRH. His father thought he was wasting his time. Walter Hayes believed in honest work, in the kind of labor that left calluses on your hands and dirt under your fingernails. Radio was a hobby for city boys, Not for farmers who needed every pair of hands they could get, but Martha protected her son's passion. She understood in a way that Walter could not, that Leonard's gifts were rare and precious, and that the world beyond Broken Bow would need him someday. Leonard graduated from high school in 1939, the year the war began in Europe. He had been accepted to the University of Nebraska to study electrical engineering, a dream that seemed impossibly glamorous for a farm boy who had grown up without indoor plumbing. But money was scarce, and the farm needed labor, and Leonard's college plans were deferred again and again as the Depression lingered and the rains failed to come. Then, on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Leonard enlisted 3 days later. He did not enlist out of patriotism, though he was patriotic enough. He did not enlist for adventure, though the prospect of seeing the world beyond Nebraska held a certain appeal. He enlisted because he understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent years listening to voices from across the continent, that this war would be fought with radio waves as much as with bullets, and he wanted to be part of it. Basic training was at Fort Riley, Kansas, and Leonard hated almost every minute of it. He was not athletic. He was not aggressive. He did not take naturally to the shouting and the marching and the endless physical demands that the army placed on its recruits. He was small and wiry, with the pallid complexion of someone who had spent too many hours indoors, hunched over radio equipment, and the drill sergeant singled him out for special attention. But Leonard endured. He endured because he knew that somewhere beyond the obstacle courses and the rifle ranges was a place where his skills would matter. The army needed radio operators, signals intelligence specialists, men who could listen to the enemy and decode their secrets. He just had to survive long enough to get there. After basic training, Leonard was assigned to the Signal Corps and sent to a specialized school at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. There, for the first time since enlisting, he felt like he belonged. The curriculum covered everything from radio theory to cryptography, from direction finding to traffic analysis. Leonard absorbed it all with the hungry intensity of someone who had been waiting his whole life for this moment. He finished first in his class, earning the attention of instructors who recognized his unusual aptitude. But recognition in training did not translate to respect in the field. Leonard shipped out for Europe in the summer of 1944, assigned to a signals intelligence unit attached to the First Army. His job was to intercept German radio communications, locate enemy transmitters, and provide intelligence that could be used by combat commanders. It should have been the perfect assignment for someone with his skills. Instead, it became a daily exercise in frustration. The unit was commanded by a captain named Welch, a career officer who had risen through the ranks by following regulations and avoiding controversy. Welch believed in doing things by the book, using standard-issue equipment, following established procedures. He distrusted innovation and despised anyone who challenged his authority. Leonard challenged his authority constantly. The problem was the equipment. The Army's standard radio receivers were adequate for routine intercepts, but they missed a significant portion of German transmissions. The Germans used a variety of frequencies and encoding techniques, and they were constantly changing their procedures to evade Allied listening posts. Leonard knew that he could do better. He had spent years building custom antennas in Nebraska, learning through trial and error how to pull weak signals out of the noise. He understood the physics of radio propagation in a way that the Army's standard training did not teach. He tried to explain this to Captain Welch. Welch was not interested. The captain told Leonard that the Army had spent millions of dollars developing its signals intelligence equipment, that teams of engineers with advanced degrees had designed every component, and that a farm boy from Nebraska was not going to improve on their work with scrap metal and rusty wire. Leonard tried to argue. He tried to explain that the Army's engineers, brilliant as they were, had designed equipment for average conditions, and that the specific terrain and atmospheric conditions of the European theater created opportunities that standard equipment could not exploit. Welch told him to shut up and follow orders. Leonard shut up. But he did not stop thinking. At night, after his shifts were over, he began to scavenge. He collected discarded wire from demolished buildings. He salvaged capacitors and resistors from broken radios. He found a roll of copper tubing in the ruins of a German factory and straightened it by hand, foot by painstaking foot, and he began to build. The antenna took shape over several weeks, assembled in stolen moments when Welch was not watching, hidden beneath a tarp behind the signals tent like a guilty secret. Leonard called it the Cornhusker, after his home state's nickname, though he never said this out loud. To the other men in the unit, it was simply the contraption, or the junk pile, or most commonly, the rusty wire. It looked like nothing the Army had ever produced. The main element was a loop of copper tubing, 3 feet in diameter, mounted on a wooden frame that Leonard had salvaged from a destroyed farmhouse. From this loop extended a complex web of wires, each cut to a precise length and arranged in a pattern that looked chaotic, but was actually the result of careful mathematical calculation. The other radio operators laughed when they saw it. Private Morrison, a Brooklyn kid with a sharp tongue, said it looked like something a crazy person would build in their basement. Corporal Jankowski, a Polish-American from Chicago, suggested that Leonard should hang it in a cornfield to scare away crows. Sergeant Reeves, the unit's senior NCO, just shook his head and muttered about wasted time. Leonard ignored them all. He knew what he had built. He knew that the loop antenna's directional characteristics would allow him to pinpoint transmitter locations with greater accuracy than the Army's standard dipoles. He knew that the carefully tuned secondary elements would resonate at frequencies that the standard equipment could not reach. He knew that the whole assembly, ugly as it was, represented years of accumulated knowledge and instinct. He just needed a chance to prove it. That chance came on the night of November 14th, 1944. The unit was stationed in the Hürtgen Forest, one of the bloodiest battlegrounds of the European theater. The fighting had been going on for weeks, and the American forces were taking terrible casualties in the dense woodland, where German defenders used the terrain to devastating effect. Intelligence was desperately needed. The commanders wanted to know where the German units were positioned, where they were moving, what they were planning, but the forest itself seemed to swallow radio signals, and the standard intercept equipment was picking up less and less as the Germans adapted their procedures. Captain Welch was under pressure from above, and that pressure rolled downhill onto his men. That evening, Leonard approached Welch with a proposal. He told the captain that he wanted to test his antenna. He told him that he believed he could pick up transmissions that the standard equipment was missing. He told him that if it did not work, he would disassemble the contraption and never mention it again. Welch looked at Leonard with the particular contempt that career officers reserved for enlisted men who did not know their place. He told Leonard that he was not going to waste operational time on amateur experiments. He told him that the antenna was an embarrassment to the unit and should have been disposed of weeks ago. He told him that if Leonard mentioned it again, he would be transferred to a Graves registration unit. Leonard saluted and walked away, but he did not give up. That night after midnight, when Welch was asleep and the other operators were drowsing at their posts, Leonard quietly connected his antenna to his radio set. He had modified the receiver as well, adjusting its circuits to work with the Cornhusker's unique characteristics. It was against regulations. It was against orders. It was potentially grounds for court-martial. Leonard did not care. He put on his headphones, adjusted the tuning dial, and began to listen. The first transmission came through at 0247 hours. It was a German artillery unit, calling for coordinates from a forward observer. The voice was clear and sharp, as if the speaker was sitting in the next room instead of somewhere in the dark forest miles away. Leonard's hands moved automatically, writing down the information, noting the frequency, estimating the direction based on the antenna's orientation. He had done this 1,000 times before, but never with such clarity, never with such precision. He adjusted the antenna slightly, rotating the loop a few degrees, and suddenly there was another voice. This one was a logistics officer, requesting ammunition and fuel for a panzer unit. The unit designation, the quantities requested, the supply route they intended to use. All of it flowing through Leonard's headphones like water through a pipe. He kept writing. The night unfolded in a cascade of intercepted transmissions, German commanders calling for reinforcements, reconnaissance patrols reporting American positions, medical units requesting evacuation routes for wounded, staff officers discussing attack plans for the following morning. And then, at 0312 hours, Leonard heard something that made his blood run cold. A German colonel was issuing orders for an ambush. A convoy of American trucks, carrying wounded soldiers from the front to a field hospital, would be passing through a particular crossroads at dawn. The Germans knew the route, knew the timing, knew that the convoy would be lightly defended because the Americans did not expect an attack so far behind the lines. The colonel was ordering 2 companies of infantry and a section of anti-tank guns to set up positions along the road. He was discussing fields of fire, fallback positions, the disposition of prisoners. He was planning to slaughter wounded men in their stretchers. Leonard's hand trembled as he wrote down the coordinates. He checked them twice, 3 times, making sure he had them exactly right. Then he reached for the field telephone. The duty officer at division headquarters was a young lieutenant who sounded half asleep when he answered. Leonard identified himself and began to relay the intelligence. The lieutenant was skeptical. He wanted to know how a signals sergeant had obtained this information. He wanted to know why it was not coming through official channels. He wanted to know why Leonard was calling in the middle of the night, with intelligence that contradicted the day's assessments. Leonard did not have time for skepticism. He told the lieutenant that 200 American soldiers were going to die at dawn if they did not act. He told him that the coordinates were exact, that the information was reliable, that every minute they wasted arguing was a minute closer to massacre. Something in Leonard's voice must have convinced the lieutenant, because the questions stopped. The lieutenant said he would pass the intelligence up the chain. He told Leonard to stay by the phone. Leonard hung up and went back to his headphones. The transmissions kept coming. Leonard kept intercepting, kept writing, kept building a picture of German operations in the sector that was more complete and more accurate than anything the intelligence officers had seen in weeks. By the time the sun rose over the Hürtgen Forest, he had filled 23 pages of notes, 47 separate transmissions, 47 windows into the enemy's mind, and somewhere on a forest road, a convoy of wounded Americans was taking a different route, guided by intelligence that Leonard Hayes had pulled from the ether with an antenna made of rusty wire and salvaged copper. Captain Welch burst into the signals tent at 07:30 hours, his face red with fury. He had been awakened by a phone call from division headquarters. A colonel wanted to know why critical intelligence was being transmitted directly from an enlisted man instead of through proper channels. Why had the captain not been informed? What was going on in his unit? Welch looked at Leonard, who was still sitting at his radio set, hollow-eyed with exhaustion, surrounded by pages of handwritten notes, and he saw the antenna. The Cornhusker was still connected to Leonard's receiver, its loop of copper tubing catching the morning light, its web of wires glistening with dew. Welch demanded to know what Leonard had done. Leonard told him. He told him about the 47 transmissions. He told him about the ambush that had been planned for the convoy. He told him about the artillery coordinates, the panzer movements, the reconnaissance reports, the medical evacuation routes. He told him that his rusty wire had done in one night what the standard equipment had failed to do in weeks. Welch's face went through a remarkable series of expressions. Fury gave way to disbelief, which gave way to something that might have been fear. The captain was a bureaucrat, not a soldier, and he understood suddenly that he was standing at a crossroads that would define his career. He could claim credit for Leonard's work. He could present it to the colonels as the result of his own leadership, his own flexibility in allowing his men to innovate. Or he could punish Leonard for disobeying orders, for using unauthorized equipment, for circumventing the chain of command. Before Welch could decide, the tent flap opened and a colonel walked in. Colonel Harrison was the division's intelligence chief, a career officer who had risen through the ranks by being smarter and more capable than anyone around him. He had received Leonard's intelligence reports overnight, had verified them against other sources, and had come to the signals tent to find out what was going on. He asked who had intercepted the transmissions. Leonard stood up and identified himself. Harrison looked at the young sergeant with the sunken eyes and the ink-stained fingers, and then he looked at the contraption of wire and copper tubing that hung outside the tent. He asked if that was the antenna. Leonard said that it was. Harrison walked outside and studied the Cornhusker for a long moment. He reached out and touched one of the wires, feeling its gauge and tension. He examined the loop antenna, noting its diameter and the angle at which it was mounted. Then he came back inside and asked Leonard to explain how it worked. Leonard explained. He talked about resonant frequencies and directional characteristics, about ionospheric propagation and ground wave effects, about the specific modifications he had made to exploit the unique conditions of the Hürtgen Forest. Harrison listened without interrupting. When Leonard was finished, the colonel turned to Captain Welch. He told Welch that the intelligence Leonard had gathered overnight was the most valuable single contribution his unit had made in the entire campaign. He told him that the convoy ambush had been averted, that the artillery coordinates had been used to call in counter-battery fire, that the panzer movements had been tracked and interdicted. He told him that Sergeant Hayes had probably saved more American lives in one night than most soldiers saved in an entire war. Welch started to speak, started to explain that Leonard had acted without authorization, that proper procedures had not been followed, that the chain of command had been violated. Harrison cut him off. He told Welch that he did not care about procedures. He told him that he cared about results. He told him that the army existed to win wars, not to enforce bureaucratic regulations. Then he turned to Leonard and asked him a question. He asked if Leonard could build more antennas like the Cornhusker. He asked if Leonard could teach other operators to use them. He asked if Leonard could help the entire division improve its signals intelligence capabilities. Leonard said that he could. Harrison nodded. He told Leonard that effective immediately, he was being transferred to division headquarters. He would be given a workshop, materials and a team of operators to train. He would report directly to Harrison's staff, bypassing the normal chain of command. Then Harrison looked at Welch one more time. He told the captain that he would be receiving new orders shortly. There was a supply depot in Belgium that needed a competent administrator. Welch's face went pale. Harrison walked out of the tent without another word. The months that followed were the most productive of Leonard Hayes's life. He built 17 Cornhusker antennas, each one slightly different, each one optimized for specific frequencies and conditions. He trained 43 radio operators in the techniques he had developed, teaching them to listen, not just for what the Germans were saying, but for the subtle patterns in how they said it. His workshop became legendary within the signals intelligence community. Officers from other divisions visited to study his methods. Engineers from the Signal Corps headquarters in Washington requested copies of his designs. The techniques he had developed in the Hürtgen Forest spread throughout the European theater, improving intercept capabilities across the entire front. Leonard received the Bronze Star in February of 1945, and the Silver Star 2 months later, after his intelligence helped thwart a German counterattack near the Rhine. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant, then to Technical Sergeant, rising faster than anyone in his original unit had thought possible. But the recognition that mattered most to Leonard came from the men whose lives his work had saved. They found him sometimes, these soldiers. They tracked him down through the military grapevine, showed up at his workshop with bottles of liberated wine or packs of cigarettes, and they shook his hand and tried to find words for what they felt. The convoy that had been rerouted on November 14th carried 63 wounded men. Every one of them survived. The artillery positions that Leonard had located were destroyed by American bombers, preventing a barrage that would have fallen on an aid station full of medical personnel. The panzer movements that he had tracked were interdicted by American tank destroyers, who knew exactly where to set up their ambush because Leonard had told them. Numbers, statistics, cold facts that did not begin to capture the weight of what they meant. Leonard never knew how to respond to the gratitude. He would shake hands and mumble something about just doing his job, and he would go back to his radios and his antennas, back to the work that made sense to him in a way that human emotion sometimes did not. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and Leonard found himself facing a future he had never quite imagined. The army offered him a permanent position. They wanted him to stay on, to continue developing his techniques, to become part of the intelligence apparatus that would define the coming Cold War. Leonard considered the offer carefully. Then he wrote a letter to his mother and asked her what she thought. Martha Hayes wrote back within a week. She told her son that she was proud of him, prouder than words could express. She told him that he had done things during the war that most men would never do, that he had used his gifts to save lives and change history. But she also told him that she was getting older, that his father's health was failing, and that the farm needed someone to take care of it. She told him that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is come home. Leonard read the letter 3 times, sitting in his workshop surrounded by the equipment that had made him famous. Then he submitted his discharge papers. He came home to Nebraska in the autumn of 1945, thinner and quieter than he had been when he left, carrying a duffel bag and a box of medals that he would put in a drawer and almost never look at again. Walter Hayes died in the spring of 1946, and Leonard took over the farm. He married a local girl named Dorothy the following year, and they had 3 children together, 2 boys and a girl. Leonard never stopped building radios. He set up a workshop in the barn, and he spent his evenings and weekends there, surrounded by wire and solder and the glow of vacuum tubes. He talked to amateur operators all over the world, reaching out across the invisible highways of the ionosphere, the way he had as a boy listening to livestock prices from Omaha. But he rarely talked about the war. His children knew that their father had served in Europe, that he had earned medals, that he had done something important with radios. But the details remained vague, locked away in the same drawer where the medals gathered dust. It was not until 1983, when Leonard was 62 years old, that the story finally came out. A historian from the University of Nebraska was researching signals intelligence operations during World War II. He had found references to a sergeant named Hayes in the division records, references to a homemade antenna that had revolutionized intercept techniques in the Hürtgen Forest. The historian tracked Leonard down and asked if he would be willing to tell his story. Leonard hesitated. 40 years of silence was a heavy weight to lift. But Dorothy told him that it was time. Their grandchildren deserved to know what their grandfather had done. The world deserved to know about the farm boy who had outthought the Army's engineers with rusty wire and salvaged copper. Leonard agreed to be interviewed. The conversation lasted 6 hours. Leonard told the historian everything: the crystal radio kit his mother had bought him, the years of building antennas in Nebraska, the frustration of working under Captain Welch, the night of 47 transmissions, the workshop where he had trained a generation of radio operators. He told him about the convoy of wounded men, about the lives saved, about the letters he still received sometimes from men who remembered. And he told him about the lesson that the war had taught him. He said that innovation does not come from committees or regulations or officially approved procedures. It comes from individuals who see problems that others overlook, who have the knowledge and the courage to try something different, who are willing to be mocked and dismissed until they prove themselves right. He said that his rusty wire antenna worked because he had spent 20 years learning how radio waves behaved, not because he was smarter than the Army's engineers, but because he had knowledge they did not have. Knowledge that came from a childhood of tinkering and experimenting and listening to voices from beyond the horizon. He said that the greatest resource any organization has is the unconventional thinking of its people, and that the greatest sin is to silence that thinking in the name of conformity. The historian published his research 3 years later in a book about signals intelligence in World War II. One chapter was devoted to Leonard Hayes and the Cornhusker antenna. Leonard received the book in the mail and read it with Dorothy sitting beside him. When he finished the chapter about himself, he closed the book and sat quietly for a long time. Dorothy asked him what he was thinking. Leonard told her that he was thinking about the night of November 14th, 1944, about sitting alone in that tent while everyone else slept, listening to German voices in his headphones, writing down information that would save lives he would never see. He told her that in that moment, he had felt like everything in his life had led to that point. Every crystal radio, every homemade antenna, every hour spent learning and experimenting in the barn in Nebraska. It had all been preparation for that one night. Dorothy took his hand and held it. She told him that she understood. Leonard Hayes died in 2001 at the age of 80. His workshop in the barn was preserved exactly as he had left it, and his children donated his papers and equipment to the University of Nebraska. But before he died, something remarkable happened. In 1998, 54 years after the night in the Hürtgen Forest, Leonard received a letter from Germany. The letter was from a man named Klaus Richter, a historian who had spent decades researching German radio operations during World War II. Richter had discovered, through captured Wehrmacht records, that the German Signals Corps had become aware of the American intercept capabilities in the Hürtgen Forest sector. They had noticed that their transmissions were being picked up on frequencies they thought were secure, and they had tried desperately to understand how. The German radio officers had assumed the Americans had developed some new technology, some secret weapon that could penetrate their communications security. They had changed frequencies, altered procedures, moved transmitters, and still the intercepts continued. They never imagined that a single sergeant with a homemade antenna was responsible. Richter wrote to Leonard because he wanted to understand what had happened. He wanted to know how an American enlisted man had outperformed not only his own army's equipment, but also the German Signals Corps' assumptions about what was possible. Leonard wrote back. He explained about the loop antenna, about the resonant frequencies, about the atmospheric conditions in the forest. He explained about his childhood in Nebraska, about the crystal radio kit his mother had bought him, about the years of learning and experimentation that had prepared him for that one night. Richter published Leonard's letter in a German military history journal. It became something of a sensation in signals intelligence circles, a reminder that the most sophisticated technology can be defeated by one person with sufficient knowledge and determination. Several of the German veterans who had served in the Hürtgen Forest wrote to Leonard after the article was published. They told him that they had lost friends to the American interdictions that his intelligence had made possible. They told him that they had hated the unknown American who seemed to know their every move. But they also told him that they respected him. War is a terrible thing, one of them wrote, but it is also a contest of skill and will. You won that contest. There is honor in losing to someone worthy. Leonard kept all of these letters in a box in his workshop, alongside the letters from the American soldiers whose lives he had saved. He read them sometimes late at night, when Dorothy was asleep and the house was quiet. He thought about the young men on both sides who had died in that frozen forest, German and American alike. He thought about the voices he had heard in his headphones, the officers and soldiers and frightened boys who had been reduced to radio transmissions, to intelligence data, to coordinates on a map. He thought about how easy it had been to forget that those voices belonged to human beings. And he thought about the strange mercy of time which allowed former enemies to correspond with respect and even warmth, which allowed old men to acknowledge each other's courage across the decades. Leonard's last letter to Klaus Richter was written 2 weeks before he died. He told the German historian that he had never hated the enemy. He told him that he had simply been a farm boy from Nebraska who was good with radios, doing a job that needed to be done. He told him that the war had taught him many things, but the most important was that every voice on the radio, friend or enemy, belonged to someone's son. He told him that he hoped the young people of their two countries would never have to learn the lessons that their generation had been forced to learn. Klaus Richter read that letter at Leonard's memorial service, which was held in the small Lutheran church in Broken Bow, where Leonard had been baptized 80 years before. Dorothy had invited the German historian to attend, and he had flown across the Atlantic to pay his respects. He stood before the congregation of farmers and townspeople and veterans, and he read Leonard's words in his accented English. When he was finished, he folded the letter carefully and presented it to Dorothy. He told her that her husband had been an extraordinary man. He told her that the respect Leonard had earned extended across oceans and decades and the vast gulf of wartime enmity. He told her that Leonard Hayes would not be forgotten. Today, in a display case in the University of Nebraska's engineering building, there sits a loop antenna made of copper tubing and salvaged wire. A small placard explains its history, tells the story of the night of 47 transmissions, describes how a farm boy's contraption changed the course of a battle. The placard does not tell the whole story, it cannot, but anyone who looks at that antenna, that contraption of rusty wire and scavenged parts, can understand something important, that sometimes the things that change history do not look impressive at all, that sometimes genius hides in the most unlikely places, that sometimes the distance between enemies is smaller than we imagine, and that sometimes all it takes to save 200 lives is one person who refuses to stop listening. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share in the comments what moved you most, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. These stories remind us that courage takes many forms, and that the quiet heroes often make the biggest difference. Help us keep these memories alive by sharing this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.